So, like I said, today it's going to be me and Allie. So, my name is Michael Decker. I am the director of graduate student support over in the College of Graduate Studies. So, I oversee all of this programming that you get emails about, probably, once a week during the height of the semester. I also do um, a lot of like outdoor education programs as well. We do a wilderness education course in the summer. And we really try to identify just areas of need for graduate students and provide opportunities to among other things, help your mental health, help your professional development, help find professional connections and resources and just basically provide augmented support where maybe departments are limited, right? So that's really what I oversee. And then Allie, is going to jump in here in the middle, but she is a licensed psychologist over in the Counseling Mental Health Center. And so really, I think that, we've created a pretty good team here because, where well, maybe Allie's a good team for me because where I am unqualified to speak, Allie really can kind of step in and provide a kind of expert opinion.
Well,
So,
I just want to
yeah,
add really
yeah.
quickly, this is an area in which both myself and Michael have been engaging in research related to this topic, as this is becoming a more crucial issue that's coming up for graduate students in particular. And so I think, even though Michael might not be able to speak to necessarily mental health recommendations, he does have a lot of insight and understanding around this topic. And I feel like there's something about right now in this time that makes this topic particularly relevant for individuals. So I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited that you're here to be a part of this conversation and hopefully, there's something that you take away from this conversation.
Yeah, I think that actually that's a really good point. And so what Ali is discussing is that Ali and I have been a part of a research team over about the last year and a half now. It's been going on for a while where we did University of Idaho was part of a national survey of on graduate student mental health. And one of the most striking findings that we found in our data after doing that survey and that we're actually under review to have published right now was that wasn't surprising, but that increased perceived financial threat, which I'll get into this idea of like financial threat versus perceived financial threat here in a moment. But perceived financial threat was basically related to an increase in every mental health variable that we screen for. So that's, depression, anxiety, low self-efficacy. It was pretty much connected to every mental health factor that we screen for. So it was pretty striking. And so yeah, so that's kind of where a lot of this comes from. And so yeah, I think I've maybe kind of read more into sort of the financial threat portion, and then Allie kind of brings that relevant knowledge about what appropriate mental health interventions are, right? So, getting into that though, there is some terminology I'm probably going to throw around in this piece. One is financial threat. So this is not perceived financial threat. This is like financial threat. It's the material danger that resource scarcity poses to an individual. So if you don't have money to afford food, right, that poses an actual physiological risk, right, to you. Housing insecurity is another one, right? These are all things that we know that some graduate students experience. Then there's also perceived financial threat. And perceived financial threat is something that is tossed out in the literature a lot because it's really hard to measure actual financial threat because we can't ask for everybody's credit score. You know what I mean? Like there's certain things we can't screen for very well in surveys. So oftentimes, this is a kind of psychometric variable that you'll hear tossed out more, which is perceived financial threat, which just measures how much somebody is feeling financially threatened at that time, right? And it's something it's just more measurable. And so you'll often hear those be used as distinct terms. It's not something that is trying to undermine somebody's financial threat. It's just that it's just used as a unit of measurement, really. Um, There's basic needs insecurity, B&I, that we throw out. Basic needs insecurity is just a lack of consistent access to things that we often see as basic human rights, such as food, shelter, water, clothing, childcare, utilities. And what I think is really interesting too is technology is becoming more and more of a basic, a basic need, right? So access to reliable internet. Right? It's pretty hard to participate in a meaningful way in society, right? At any high level, without reliable access to internet. So we're starting to now see a lot of the literature include things like this as well.
I'll
Um,
just add
yeah.
to
Oh,
that
yeah.
as
Yeah.
well. As someone who works at the university, and we definitely address a lot of we kind of talk about these issues, and they're really kind of uh, been more on our radar in recent years, especially because we're looking at some of the data that's been collected over the last year or so, just about, it's not necessarily specific to graduate students, but students here at the university. And we do start seeing in recent years more of the concerns when it comes to those basic needs and security. And so that is something that's been coming up a lot more. And I think it's important to acknowledge that if that's something you're experiencing, you are definitely not alone.
Yeah. I'm going to get into this more in a minute too. And it's also something that's largely out of individuals' control too. I think that sometimes we bear a lot of responsibility, for our own financial situation. And there are times where certain aspects of it are somewhat out of our control. And there's something empowering, I think, in having the information that allows you to see that as well. A couple last ones too is just cost of living is another term I'm going to throw out. Cost of living is just the amount of money required for things like housing, food, taxes, and healthcare in a specific location and time. So it kind of has this spatio-temporal element to it, right? Those things change, right, based on where you are and what time period that's happening in. So obviously, the cost of living in Idaho in 2025 is different than the cost of living in Canada in 2017, right? So these are things that they're kind of always changing, they're dynamic, and that's what makes it sometimes so difficult for individuals to navigate. And then also this term socioeconomic, that's something that like I feel like you just hear people throw that word out all the time. But really what's being referred to there is a combination of social and economic factors. So especially as it relates to groups of people based on social class, right? I think that it's usually, when you're making a point about class distinctions in a particular society, as it relates to their economic mobility or their access to basic needs, things like that. That's something that we commonly refer to as a sort of a socioeconomic nexus, right? Um, I also want to say too that I want to ground this entire idea of financial threat um in like one of the most basic psychological premises that we have, right? Which is Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs. And I really think that when I started to study financial threat in graduate students, like all of a sudden, I mean, I had heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but all of a sudden it like lit up to me as like, oh, it's like so simple. It's so, of course, and really it was because my thought was, oh my gosh, if people can't meet their basic needs and if they can't feel safe, then they can't like tap into the higher levels of what Maslow refers to as self-actualization, right? High levels of critical thinking, creativity, advanced morality, right? Acceptance of facts, things like, these things that are crucial for success in graduate school. It's really hard to tap into those things if you don't have your basic needs met. So as cost of living goes up, um, and groups of individuals, not just graduate students, but just those who are not high income earners, right, are impacted more and more by increases in cost of living. Meeting your basic needs becomes harder, and thus the levels of thought that are required to be successful in highly professionalized spaces like graduate school becomes harder and harder. Right? It's like it actually became really simple, and so simple that I couldn't believe that more people weren't talking about it specifically in graduate students. I was like, this is actually like one of the most impacted groups probably by this. But I think that graduate school is often perceived as being a somewhat privileged space, right? I think that historically we have seen graduate school as a place where, it's like, people who maybe come from more affluent backgrounds like go to graduate school, which we know isn't true. Actually, there are a lot of people who are first generation students and who are supporting themselves, who are trying to put themselves through graduate school on relatively, low stipends, right? And these things are, I think that sometimes they, have not necessarily been acknowledged, right? And also because the demographic that we see in school is changing all the time, right? I mean, maybe there was a time when that was more true, right? When primarily people from, the upper middle class, and upper class attended graduate school, but we know that's not necessarily true now, right? Um, and so anyway, so I just wanted to ground this. Allie, I see you want to also say something.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
just,
yeah, yeah.
I think I would like to kind of also connect it back to what we're finding with graduate students. And I think that's, as Michael mentioned earlier, we're seeing these connections between that perceived financial threat and other factors like mental health related factors. And I think what's really interesting about that conversation is you can be struggling with mental health challenges. You might struggle with confidence, self-esteem, relationships. But if we're struggling with the more basic things like meeting our physical needs and safety, then those other things, while they're still important, may not be at the forefront of our thoughts and our efforts, right? Because we need to get those more basic needs met first. And so when you're thinking about what's the most challenging thing for you, those might not be the priority items. It might be the more basic things. And I think that's important to highlight because you might have other things that are happening for you. And it does, our research suggests that, if we're struggling with the more basic things, then we might be also experiencing challenges in other areas of our functioning and lives, whether that's mental health, whether that's kind of our perceivement of ourselves and relationships, whether that's higher kind of critical thinking, like we mentioned earlier. And so I just wanted to highlight that because if this is something that you experience, you might notice that more of your thoughts and feelings are kind of focused on this particular issue over others. And I find sometimes meeting with people for counseling that can be really frustrating. And I think I just want to normalize that a little bit, that would be what we expect. And I think that that's a normal experience for individuals. And so it can be really hard. And I just want to validate and acknowledge that real challenge.
No, that's a really good point, Allie. Thank you. And so yeah, I also want to say too, that again, because right now I'm grounding things, right? I'm trying to put this conversation in sort of a really large context. And so another thing to keep in mind too is that sometimes, the individual financial stress that you're feeling, it's a combination of personal choices, but also where maybe those choices meet, a global pandemic or, supply chain clogs or, government policy or, any number of factors. And so I think that, that's why it becomes so complicated and stressful and why that perceived financial stress that we were talking about, really becomes important because, you're having this like threat sort of come up psychologically that may be somewhat unavoidable actually for you, um and people oftentimes they sort of take a lot on. I also want to point out too that um where we have seen pay across the board become relatively stagnant in recent years. We have, since December of 2020, seen the single largest increase in cost of living, at least here in the US, but also globally, since the 1970s, at least in the US, right? I mean, obviously, hyperinflation has happened elsewhere, but at least in the US, this has been the largest inflationary period that we've had since the Carter administration, right? So actually, there has, it's like I think everyone knows, like it's not imaginary. Prices have gone up, rent has gone up, groceries have gone up, and I think that probably, Ali mentioned earlier, like we hear more and more from students coming to us experiencing a lot of financial problems. It's almost certainly because of this, right? Like I think that just calling it what it is, it's more expensive right now to live, and it's something that is not just being experienced in graduate school, it's being experienced kind of everywhere right now. Um, did you want to say something, Ali? Or
Yeah, well, and I think I want to highlight that this is a real shared experience. I know sometimes we can feel isolated in these experiences, but I think there are a number of contributing factors that are leading to graduate students feeling this financial threat. And I just want to highlight that you are not alone. We are seeing that across the board. And so, sometimes when we are struggling with finances, we may tend to kind of look inward and blame ourselves or our habits or things like that. But when we see over and over that graduate students across the board, we're seeing high reports of financial threat. Just, I think it highlights that sense of a shared experience and that it's not just you if you are experiencing that.
Yeah, and so there's also a pretty large body of literature that's beginning to, not necessarily make the connection between mental health and graduate students, but that has made the explicit, they've kind of uh, they have identified financial threat in graduate students, and they have also identified a corresponding mental health crisis in graduate students. And there's beginning to be literature, i.e., what we're working on, that is trying to link the two, right? And so, what the literature says about graduate students. So, for instance, like we know, this is a phenomenon that we always see is that when cost of living goes up, but wages don't go up, typically individuals they supplement with debt. We have seen, at least as of the time that this is what 2019. At that point, the average student loan debt per borrower had doubled since 2007, right? And I think that rate has actually even gone up in recent years, and that rate's also even higher for graduate students. That does include like law school and med school as well, though. So there's some skewing and some interpretation there. But we have seen the rates of student borrowing go up significantly. Um, we also know that, according to a lot of studies, most graduate students do feel stressed about finances. So one study found that 60% of masters and 55% of doctoral students, reported feeling stressed about their finances. And I have these listed out here, and I have the sources at the end of this presentation. Um, there's another study that found that 18.5% of graduate students reported low food security, and about 21.8% reported very low food insecurity. And then this is right around the same time, you have other literature starting to bubble up. So this is Evans et al. This is actually a pretty famous, very cited survey, found that graduate students were about 3 times more likely to suffer from a major mental health disorder than the general public. That was initially it was 6 times. It was amended uh, recently, and they came up with actually 3 times. Um, and then uh, we also know that graduate students are less likely, on average, to seek help for their mental health. When they're experiencing mental health stress, they're less likely than the general public to seek help. And so what we see, right, is we have these sort of two co-evolving crises, right? One mental health, one financial, that are sort of popping up alongside each other. And I don't think that that's probably a coincidence. And I think that a lot of people are starting to assume that they're not. That they're not actually a coincidence. Um, Stuff that we do know, though, right? Here's some other statistics, because I don't want this to be like a doom and gloom type of presentation. I don't think that I don't think that it needs to be, frankly. I'm someone who's been to graduate school and paid for graduate school myself, and understand how stressful it can be financially. And you know, what we do know is that there's strong evidence to suggest that one's level of education attainment is directly correlated to a higher lifetime earning potential. We know that. the higher, the education on average, obviously there are always exceptions that can be highlighted to this. I'm not trying to deny that, but generally we know that if somebody achieves a higher level of education, they tend to earn more over the course of their life. There are also more safeguards in place for low-income university student populations than the general population, right? We have a number of financial safety nets that I think Allie might have a little bit of information on that we can talk about for university students. We have a food pantry. We also have a robust grant and fellowship support program that is aimed in a lot of ways at trying to find more robust funding sources for students. We do want to offer the support that we can to our graduate students in lieu of what I think, the most obvious solution to all of this is, which is, of course, paying people more. It's not, I'm not trying to dance around that. It's just, these are the resources that people like me and Allie can offer, right? And I think that we want people to know about them. We also know that graduate school is one of the single most important networking stages of your professional life. And we know that people who have a larger professional network tend to do better professionally and thus, equate that to higher earning potential over the course of their life, right? And so, and the other thing that we do know about perceived financial threat is that a undeniable protective factor against perceived financial threat is perceived social support, right? We know that individuals who report higher perceived social support on average report less perceived financial threat. There's a number of conclusions you can draw as to why that is. One of them could be because if you have a more robust social network, you probably have access to more kinds of support, right? And those could be anything from, mental health support to, financial support that you could receive as well, right? And so I think that something that I always want to note here is that because we know that social support is such a strong protective factor. It's something that we are deeply invested in here in COGS and trying to help support. So, one thing that we know is that community groups can be, really powerful places, in terms of, psychological, relief and stress relief for people, right? So we want to help build community support groups and community networks for people. So if you are somebody who has ideas for these things, I do my best to try to create them where I can, but we're interested in hearing your ideas for those. Um, there's lots and lots and lots of different uh, you know support options we have here at the university. Allie, I know is going to get a little bit more into this in her talk, but you know, we have career counseling and mental health services and the dean of students when you're experiencing um, you know, really sensitive situations. And we have support programming, the food pantry. Allie and I looked it up. There's free public transportation for students who attend U of I. We are also trying to come up with more options for mindfulness and meditation practices. We did a really good international student group session last semester on mindfulness that was like one of the best. It was small, but it was a really nice workshop, right? And so we're trying to invest in more support, with that. I know that there's yoga classes that university students can take, and people report, those being really useful as well. And then also, participating in grant and fellowship initiatives, like I said, like, something that I feel really strongly about is helping people try to locate funding opportunities because, frankly, sometimes they pay a lot more, right? So, we did just out of COGS alone, we did 9 different National Science Foundation graduate research fellowship applications this fall. We'll find out about them in, this spring. We don't know yet if anyone has received them, but if people get those pay significantly more than the general assistantship. And I'm interested in working with people to locate funding opportunities like that because I think that that is one way that we can try to get people more access to resources. Those things also usually come with, health insurance allowances, and they come with travel allowances, and those are things that I think are worth looking into. And then also just considering the full spectrum of employment available to you after graduation, then, kind of a generic narrative about job trajectory too. I think that sometimes people get really stressed about finances because they only, basically people think like, I have to be a professor, right? I have to be a tenured track professor, and there's like not a lot of those jobs, and that tends to stress people out. And I think that sometimes when I've talked to people and they begin to consider the full spectrum of opportunities that is available to them after graduation, that also tends to alleviate a degree of financial stress as well, because they realize that there are lots of relatively well-paying opportunities that they can pursue, right? So there's a lot you can look into. What I wanted to do just with my first half is just essentially say, you're not alone, like Ali said. If you are feeling stressed financially, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of people are feeling that way right now too. And, and Allie, we can't always take away that financial stress, but we are both very invested in different ways with trying to help people navigate that. Right. So, Allie, I'm gonna
Oh,
kind
actually, if you could go back to the last slide, I just wanted to
yeah.
kind of talk a little bit about the campus community resources because I'm definitely like boots on the ground. I send people to these resources all the time. This comes up, I think, a lot more than people realize. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things that are related to some of the items listed here and a couple of resources that aren't listed here. So with regards to the Counseling and Mental Health Center, obviously we're here for your mental health experiences. It doesn't have to be a serious mental health issue for you to reach out to us. Let me just highlight that. But sometimes we help people navigate the stresses that they experience related to finances. And sometimes if you're not sure where to go and you're looking for some guidance, we can help you point you in the right direction. Another piece that we have here at the Counseling Center is we do offer case management. Which is just a fancy word of like connecting you to resources. So sometimes when people are experiencing more significant financial insecurity and they're needing help getting connected to, for example, state resources or signing up for state resources, we can sometimes help navigate that and also get you connected to particular resources that might be helpful and beneficial to you. So that is something we offer. With the Dean of Students, I actually recently met with them and learned about a couple of things I didn't know about that they're offering right now. So one that they've offered for a while, if you're really in a tough financial place, they do have an emergency fund that you can apply to. And that is an option if you're really stuck in a bind and really in a bad place financially, and you just need help to get pay for some really basic things. They can help you with that. They also have, I can't remember the official name, but some sort of basic needs kits. So for whether that's you or somebody who could really benefit from some kind of basic items, they have these little kind of drawstring bags full of those kind of basic needs, and it's very obscure. There's nothing on the bag, so it wouldn't look kind of abnormal, but they are handing those out to students who could benefit from that. They also do laptop rentals. So sometimes this is really helpful if you're mid-semester and your laptop dies and you don't have the finances to get a laptop in that moment. You can reach out to the Dean of Students, and they do have a number of laptops that they'll rent per semester. So if that's something you experience, you can reach out to them for that. With regards to the food pantry, obviously we have the Vandal Food Pantry that's here on campus. If you're not aware of it, we do have it. But we also have some community food pantries for those looking to maybe go off campus. I've heard really good things at Inland Oasis in regards to their food pantry, but there's a couple here in the community as well. Public transportation, there is both free transportation around town and to campus. That's, I think, called Smart something transportation. I apologize, I don't have the name right off the top of my head. So that's one option. And I also think in looking at the website that students are eligible for, a certain amount of money with regards to Lyft for, Smart Transit. Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. And there's a certain amount of money that can go towards Lyft rides. So in the evenings when Smart Transit isn't running, that might be an option you can look into as well. So those are just a couple things. I think the really big resource I'm going to encourage you is financial aid. I know a lot of people know it's here on campus, but I don't think a lot of people reach out to them very often. They don't have opportunity to connect with them. If you're struggling with regards to your tuition or your financial aid, one, they are really helpful at answering questions, and I've heard really good things with students working with them. And if you're really in a bind, sometimes they can connect you to potential scholarships that you might be eligible for that you didn't even realize was available. So sometimes they can be helpful in that end of things too. So I would really encourage you, if you particularly have any financial stress as it relates to tuition and school, I would highly encourage reaching out to the financial aid office. They are a wonderful resource.
Yeah, can I say too, off of that is that financial aid does, I think that people just associate them with student loans, but they do a
Yes.
lot that's not related to student loans as well. And for instance, the other thing that they want us to really emphasize to people is to fill out the FAFSA regardless of whether you intend to take out loans, because all need-based aid is tied to the FAFSA. So for instance, when I was in graduate school, um, uh, there was a lot of like COVID relief money. Not that COVID relief money comes out all the time, but people who didn't have a FAFSA on file didn't get that because they couldn't establish, need basically. So there are things like that that come about that we always encourage people to do, regardless of whether you intend to or want to take out loans. Like there are non-loan based options as well that flow through financial aid as well. So that's another reason to talk to them. So.
And I'll add to that too of, while you're here at the university, they are a resource for you. Sometimes people have questions about their loans or about their finances with regards to academics and tuition after the fact when they start getting a bill related to that, right? And then they've left the university, they've potentially moved. It makes it a little harder. And so I would encourage, if you want to know more about your loans or your financial aid or your financial situation as it relates to tuition, they are a really wonderful resource and they can answer any questions you have. And honestly, I think they're really underutilized, if I'm being honest. And I think, answering those questions now versus once you've graduated and now you have questions, that makes it a little more challenging.
I'm gonna click on over to the next one. There we go. Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to talk about some strategies that may be beneficial. Before we jump into this, I just want to acknowledge that financial stress, financial strain, this is a real issue. The ideas that I have are not going to be end all be alls. They're not going to save, they're not going to fix all of the problems. And there's clearly a problem happening at a much larger basis. But I do want to give you some ideas that may be helpful. Like I said, they're not going to be able to solve all of your issues, but it might help you feel less stressed, might make you feel a little more in control of things, and might feel like, I can manage this, that even though it might be stressful, feeling like you can manage it well. So these are just a few ideas I have, and hopefully, one or two of them are something that you can take away that might be beneficial. So my first recommendation is avoid avoidance. When we start talking about finances, you would be amazed at how often it comes up that people haven't looked at their finances, whether that's looking at the loans that they've taken out or the tuition that will be owed, or looking at things like their bank account. Sometimes I talk to students and they're like, I'm nervous. I'm anxious to pull up my bank account, to look at what is in there, what I'm spending, things like that. So if that is something you experience, I would encourage you to try avoid avoiding, which really just means, because as we avoid things that are anxiety provoking, actually over time, that anxiety tends to build. The longer I tend to avoid that, the more anxiety I have at the idea of addressing it. So if there's something with regards to finances that you feel like you've been avoiding, this might be a good kind of moment for you to think, maybe there's something I can do to just take a small step in that direction. If the idea of opening a bank, opening up your kind of bank statement or, spending or looking at that account or looking at the details of your financial loans, things like that just being an example, maybe the first step is just making sure you know how to access the account information. Sometimes that's actually something that is really challenging for people to know, like where do I look to see where my loan information is at. So maybe just that first small step is just making sure you have all the ability to access that account. And then once we've kind of gotten over that hump, maybe the next goal would be to then open the account and just look at it for a few minutes. So those are just some ideas if that's something that you're experiencing. But I do think it is important for you to know, your financial situation. And we'll talk about being proactive here next. But I think part of that is so that you can be aware of what finances, kind of the financial situation, whether that's your day-to-day kind of budgeting, spending, whether that's your financial loans, financial aid, things of that nature. But it is good to be aware of these things so that maybe reduces some of the stress, because the more you know, the less that might feel as overwhelming. So on to the next concept, and that is being proactive. Now that looks different for different people and your particular situation. So I've got some ideas, but they may not be relevant to you. It's just to get you kind of thinking about these things. So having knowledge, awareness, and understanding about your financial situation tends to make you feel less overwhelmed, less scared. Sometimes that's a fear that comes up, right? I'm scared to look at the account. I'm scared to look at the information, and can help reduce that anxiety because you have some knowledge and understanding of what is occurring. When we don't kind of know what's behind the door, it seems a bit scarier, right? So that is my encouragement is for you, if this is something you don't feel like you know about or you have a good understanding of, this is my encouragement to maybe take a look. I actually remember from my own grad school experience, as I was getting close to finishing graduate school, there were a group of us of graduate students having a conversation about, loans and things like that. And there was a real consensus around a number of graduate students that they didn't actually know how much they had built up in financial loans. They had kind of an idea, but they a few of us, mentioned that it was kind of scary to open up those loan information and to think about how much was there, or to imagine, paying it. And, sometimes there wasn't, great knowledge of like, when would I have to start paying this? How much would I have to pay when those bills start coming up post-graduation? And that's kind of why I mentioned financial aid, because they are a really helpful resource if those are questions that you have. But, it was amazing how much we didn't know. And I think that makes it a bit scarier because it does feel like, the monster on the other side of the door, right? If I can't see it, if I don't know what it is, I really don't understand it. It feels a lot scarier than the thing that I know. So my encouragement is to start building some knowledge and awareness about your finances, whether that's personal finances, whether that's academic finances, encouraging you to do that. So here are a couple, things, I'm mentioning with being proactive. Again, think about your own situation and how this applies. One idea I have is meeting with someone regarding finances. Like I mentioned, financial aid office is a great resource with regards to academic finances. Could be meeting with some sort of financial advisor or mentor, or it could be even just someone you know personally that you feel like has done well in managing their own money or has navigated paying for tuition post-graduation. Thinking about somebody in your life that you feel like is a trusted person to ask, like, how did you handle, paying your tuition or loans, or how did you navigate budgeting? How did you kind of, and I think those conversations can really go a long way. And so thinking about for you, what might be an available option of someone you can kind of reach out to. Making a plan. Now, that plan can vary from person to person. Maybe that's a plan of how you want to address your finances, or a plan for how you want to learn more about your current financial situation. But either way, thinking about what would be helpful for you as you're thinking about your current financial situation. Like I said, the more knowledge and understanding you have about finances, the less scary it feels, the more in control you feel, which is a great feeling. Again, it doesn't take away the stress that might be related to finances, but may feel like, you know what, even though this is stressful, I am able to kind of see this and manage it in a way. Some other ideas for being proactive, again, kind of dependent on your current situation. Taking a look at your finances and taking a look at your financial aid and loans. Like I mentioned before, knowledge is power. Consider where your money is going. If there's a concern with regards to personal finances, I think it's really helpful for people to take a look at where is their money going. If we're not really looking at the bank account, we might not be really looking at how we're spending our money. And that is not to put pressure on you that you're doing something wrong. Man, I am a culprit of it. I was just telling Michael the other day as we're preparing for this, I am a culprit of getting coffee to go in the morning. Not every morning, but this is something I've had to look at from time to time and reduce depending on what is in the budget or not in the budget. Sometimes I'm talking to students, it's like DoorDash, right? Or Uber Eats. And thinking about those things. What would be the cost benefit of going to pick up the food versus doing DoorDash or Uber? Or what would be the difference between cooking at home or eating out? And again, just thinking about your own financial situation and taking a look at where is money going and what would be most beneficial for you. And again, that's you being an active participant in your financial situation, which again, when we're knowledgeable about that and we're proactive in that, it makes it feel less scary and it makes it feel like we're more in control of what's happening. And then, of course, we want to talk about general strategies to help reduce stress that do relate to financial stress, but are more generalized. As you might be shocked to hear, relaxation strategies are really helpful. I'm sure some of you have heard about this. There are lots of different ways to address this. Breathing exercises, meditation, mindfulness, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga. There are a lot of different strategies out there. And my encouragement is if you found one that you're like, yeah, that wasn't so helpful for me or doesn't quite work for me, trying something else. There are a lot of different strategies out there. That is something you can work with a counselor on as well, if that's something you're interested in. But finding one that works for you and fits into your life. Sometimes I have people practice relaxation strategies as they're starting out right before bed, because oftentimes our thoughts are kind of more present right before bedtime because we can't easily distract ourselves from day-to-day things or things that are distracting. And so sometimes it can be helpful with that. Plus, it can help you get to sleep a little faster too.
Yeah, can I say on that one? I know that one tactic that I came up with in graduate school for me personally was I started getting really into running. And I found this like weird thing would happen where even if I was, I mean, whether it was financial or it was just like stress about school and academics too, I found that I would think myself into these really crazy corners. I would just like think, and I would just like feel these like immense feelings of like doom and dread, and it would just like weigh on me. And what I found is that if I went for a long run, and like it doesn't have to be a run, I'm just saying like it's a thing, right? There maybe
Find
there's
what works for
some,
you.
yeah, exactly. Like for me, it was like some movement really helped, right? I found that like the symptoms I was feeling they were really physiological. Like yes, they were mental. I was thinking a lot, but it was producing this sort of physiological response in me, right? Like I was like my heart would palpitate and like I would tense my shoulders a lot. And so going and kind of finding a physical reset, I oftentimes would come back and even if I was like, maybe I was like stressed about some financial thing or you know, um, you know, something I was doing for graduate school, I'd come back and like the problem would still be there, but I would have a kind of different perspective on it because I had alleviated a lot of these secondary physiological symptoms I was having, right? And because of that, I often came and I would be able to approach that problem in a different way. I would kind of be able to reframe it and think about it maybe more objectively. And I think that's something that Allie's getting at is that sometimes when you feel really bombarded by problems, they feel really ambiguous. They feel super kind of ill-defined and confusing, right? There's actually a lot in the literature that says that financial threat and the sort of psychological, the sort of perceived financial threat, one of the side effects of it is actually a lot of disorientation, right? There's psychological disorientation that can result from that, right? This feeling of just like being out of control and confused. And sometimes, the best remedy to that is just a little bit of movement, or some equivalent, right? Whatever your equivalent of that is, as well. I just wanted to note that's something that worked for me. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I kind of butted in
There
there,
are a
but yeah,
lot of
yeah.
approaches, and I think that's why I encourage you. It's sometimes you might hear someone say this particular strategy works for me, and that's awesome. But if it doesn't work for you, try something else. Be a little bit explorative. Try a couple different times. Try a couple different things. And find something that works for you. For me, I think one of the ones that I mentioned earlier about relaxation strategies that I'm honestly kind of biased towards is progressive muscle relaxation. I really like it because it's that practicing of holding tension in certain parts of our bodies and then releasing that tension. And it's that practice of releasing tension from our bodies. And we know with stress, particularly, there's a real mind body component to it, which makes sense why Michael's saying movement is very helpful for me. We know there's a strong connection between the mind and body, particularly with stress. And so having those physical experiences can be helpful. But I guess I would encourage you to explore this. If you want some help in figuring that out, counseling might be a helpful thing. The other thing I'm going to say is self-compassion. Oh, it's so easy with finances to feel like, is there something I'm doing wrong? Am I budgeting well enough? Sometimes there can be self-criticism and judgments, and you are not alone in that experience. Like I mentioned, sometimes I even question myself with my coffee, right? So I think in this process, you might notice that as we were talking about strategies and kind of avoiding, and trying to be proactive, you might have noticed some self-criticism. And maybe this is an opportunity for you to kind of give some compassion to yourself that these are really hard things. Being a graduate student is really hard. You are clearly not alone if you are feeling stressed from finances, as many graduate students do. And so maybe there's room for us to hold some compassion and forgiveness for ourselves with regards to finances, and maybe find some camaraderie that others within your program, within the area of graduate studies, within graduate studies across the US, that this is a shared experience. And so maybe part of that can help bring some compassion towards ourselves as we're talking about this really challenging topic. And then,
Yeah, oh,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
oh, oh,
Go
oh, yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I was just gonna say, I think that this is something I've talked with about to a few people that, and I know that there are definitely cultural differences in how people approach finances, but I know that in the U.S. a lot of people feel like a deep sense of shame around finances, and that prevents people from discussing them usually,
Oh,
right? And I think that that's also like probably a really important um, stereotype it's necessary for us to kind of overcome, regarding finances, is that it's not shameful, that it's like the most shared experience that like everyone has. Like we eat, we sleep, right? We breathe, and we all have to have money to live, right? I mean, like
yeah.
it's I mean, it is like as shared as it gets in modern society and so I think that that's something too, is just acknowledging that like in a lot of contexts we're trained to feel shame and secrecy around these things, and actually there is a lot of empowerment and having an open discussion and sort of putting those things on the table and looking at them and like I said, making them less ambiguous and more objectified, and then creating plans and having discussions with people who may have similar situations. And I think that's all really powerful stuff. And so, you know, there's some science behind it. There's also just some good old fashioned like it just feels good to like talk about things sometimes, right? So, yeah,
Yeah, and I'm reminded of when I was kind of mentioning, if you haven't looked at your bank account, if you haven't looked at your loans, like sometimes there's so much shame related to those experiences or, self-judgment that it's like the idea of opening something like that just kind of triggers those experiences, so we tend to avoid it. And so thinking about those things, having some compassion for yourself that you were definitely not alone. Sometimes even talking to your colleagues that are also in graduate school with you can be a really eye-opening experience as well. And then identify, oh, one more. Identifying ways to care for yourself. This is a really big one. And this can, again, looks different for everybody. We all have difficult days. We all have bad days. And how we approach it makes a difference. If I have a bad day and I kind of lean into that negativity, man, I'm certainly going to end on a not so great note. But if I have a bad day and I know it's happening and I think about things that might help me, right? Like I know I feel better when, right? Thinking about how you would end that sentence, thinking about activities, both small or large, that you're like, yeah, this does bring some comfort. It does bring some contentment. It does bring some joy, whatever the feeling is for you. And thinking about how can we add those into the more stressful, overwhelming days. And that can also help relieve some of that stress. Thinking about those small ways to brighten your day or mood. Great example for me, I use all the time. Man, if I have a few extra minutes in the morning, I'm not rushing out the door. I can actually have a sip of coffee. Man, maybe we're diving into my coffee issues. But having that little bit of extra time that doesn't sound like a lot, but it just means I can go at a slower pace and then kind of get started on a good day. Man, that's small, but it makes a huge difference. And thinking about for you, what are these small things that make a difference for you? And last but not least, focus on the things that are in your control. It is so easy to think about, what's going to happen in the future, or thinking about the things that we don't have control of. And we could just spiral into those. But there are a lot of things that are in your control. And we talked a little bit about that with the idea of proactiveness, but focusing on those things that are in your control. And that can be a helpful place to focus our attention on so that we can kind of prepare ourselves with regards to the stress. And
yeah,
that's what I have.
yeah. I mean, like you can't control like what prices of goods are going to be tomorrow. You know what I mean? I think like that's, that it's getting back to like, right, there's like that drastic cost of living increase that we've all experienced over the last 4 years. That's completely out of I mean, very few people have control over that, right? Like I think that acknowledging that, responding to it how you need to, but also acknowledging that like, well, this is out of I mean, there's literally nothing that you can do about that, right? There's also something freeing and just sort of seeing that as well. Um, I'm going to stop sharing, and I know that Amanda has been recording this. Amanda, if you wanted to stop recording.